It's Let's Talk Random Archaeology, episode 9, with myself, Professor Howard Williams.
And me, Afnan and Hello.
Hello,
Uh,
everybody. Now, previously, we've moved on to actually evaluating recent published peer-reviewed academic archaeological research and trying to pick out some of the more exciting and controversial articles that have come out into the archaeological world of late and talking about them randomly. And that's
yeah.
what we're going to continue today. And our episode today is going to focus on an article by Dr. Nairi Finlay of the University of Glasgow called An Archaeology of Dementia. And this is out in the journal Antiquity, volume 96, issue 386, pages 422 to 435. And her abstract reads, "Around the world, millions of people live with dementia. Archaeologists have advanced heritage management as a form of therapy, for example, through object handling, museum object handling. Here, the author proposes an alternative focus, arguing that archaeology can contribute to research on the materialities of care. Through a case study of a, quote, dementia assemblage curated by an avocational archaeologist, the author documents the embodied and material traces of the collector's earlier archaeological practices, their increasing comfort in handling stone as dementia progressed, and their sustained interest in the pyodolic properties of things. The
Ooh.
results contribute to a wider understanding of the important role of materiality for those living with dementia." So that's Nairi Finlay's abstract, in which and I made it very clear, this article doesn't look at the past. It's about how an avocational archaeologist, a person who was at least a part-time in their life, an amateur archaeologist, and when they got dementia, how they changed their attitude to the objects they'd once handled, the materials they'd once handled, and started handling natural objects. And it's
Yeah.
also, therefore, a way into thinking about how archaeology today can help people with dementia, but also to broader reflections on the role of objects in our contemporary world. So it's a kind of case study in contemporary archaeology. And I
Yeah.
also want to start off by flagging up that Nairi has also published an article, sort of sister article to this, in the Journal of Contemporary Archaeology. But we want to focus on this article and have some reflections on this sort of approach to an archaeology of dementia. And obviously this is a sensitive issue, and so we want to sort of apologize for anything we might say that is sensitive to a subject that touches everybody, every family. It can be touched by dementia at one point, and we all may be, and it's a subject that therefore becomes very personal. So we want to say very, very upfront that we welcome this as a really innovative, distinctive piece of research, but we're going to sort of bounce off that. We're going to review what it says and try to reflect on the implications of
Yeah.
Nairi's work for other kinds of archaeological research. I think that's the way we want to approach this, isn't it, Afnan?
Yeah, I think so. Like, I think the paper is very interesting, and I think it's very, well, for me especially, very new. I haven't read anything like this before, specifically about dementia in archaeology. And yeah, I think there's a lot to discuss about it, and I'm sure that we can, have, or I guess discuss a lot about what this means for the future of archaeology of dementia, or even so, like, just the future of contemporary archaeology and things like that. So,
Yeah, I mean, I
yeah.
think at one level, at one level we can characterize this paper, and it does in its introduction, it does cite some of the broader research on this area. We can characterize it as one of the many ways in which archaeologists try to show their relevance. I mean, it is about contemporary archaeology, but it's also about how there's been a whole raft of research looking at how archaeology can use objects for education, for therapy for people today, whether it's veterans excavating Anglo-Saxon graves, or it's working with victims of abuse, trauma, negligence, young offenders. How can we work with those in need or in circumstances? How can the stories from the human past and our material assemblages, our objects that can be handled, heritage sites that can be visited, how can going on walks for those that can't get out often to visit archaeological sites, how can it do good? How can we use archaeology to enrich not only our knowledge of the human past, but also our well-being. It's so at one level, I think and this is only in one way, it's framing itself as a part of that broader discussions of archaeologies of well-being for people today. And they do mention some of the previous research, which I haven't read, I confess, about dementia-friendly excavations, dementia being used, and other recreational and therapeutic ways we can use visits to ancient monuments or historic landscapes, bringing objects into hospital wards and memory boxes. They talk about that broader context, but this then embarks in a very different way, doesn't it? It says, it says archaeology makes a vital contribution to the methodologies and the social sciences, and we want to, she wants to take forward what we can do as to use objects in new ways. She talks about material citizenship, the importance of access to personal objects in care homes and other environments. And then she talks about particularly Yanis Hamalakis and his work on sensorial assemblages, how we can think about how, and this is for the past and the present, how we can think about material culture as sensorial, particularly not objects on their own, but collections of objects. So I suppose that's where this paper's coming from. On one level, it's part of the archaeology of how does archaeology do good things in our society, and how do we think, but also how we think about stuff, how we think about material culture and its relationship to people across time and space. I think that's my takeaway from the introduction.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I thought, I didn't know what I thought, to be honest. Like, I just thought it was a very interesting take because when it comes to archaeology, I do know that it has been used in many ways to engage many different people, not just necessarily to keep them busy if that's what they want, but also like to get them thinking about things that maybe they hadn't thought about before. And having worked in the archaeological field, like in that way, I used to work at the Grosvenor Museum, and we had a lot of open kind of like washing, kind of like let's do finds washing. And we had a lot of people come in because they wanted to communicate with people, they wanted to engage with the archaeology, and they wanted to learn more. So I do think that this article talks about that, about how archaeology is present in places like you said, like in the hospital and in homes and places like that, where it can, not just help people with memory things, but also just, bring them back to a time that I don't really know where I'm going with this.
No, yeah, I get what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
I just think it's good because the thing is with archaeological finds, if they're not particularly delicate, things like stones and rocks and flint, you can touch them. And I think that, as you're saying, sensory things are very, very important for not just us as archaeologists, but for people in general. And having that connection with the past is, of course, a great thing. Being able to, like, sometimes, I don't know about you, but when you find really, really beautiful pottery and you're like, oh my God, somebody used to eat out of this. Like, that's
Yes.
amazing. And I think that that connection is different for every person, but I still think it's worthwhile, like, and it's worth talking about, which is exactly what this article does. It talks about that sensitivity and that personal relationship with finds that, some people may have. Definitely worth talking about. So, yeah.
And it does set itself up as a kind of experiment, a methodological experiment, which is a bit frustrating for me, I have to say, because they don't really explain what their method is, and how they justified that method, which is a little frustrating. Maybe the sister article I mentioned before does that work, but at least in this Antiquity piece, it says it's it's trying to push boundaries, it's trying to be new, and that's no problem, and it's a case study. But I didn't really get any sense of what is the methodology that can then be taken forward from it. And in terms of the theory, yes, it mentions the sensorial assemblage thinking in archaeology of Hamalakis, the commingling and contingent co-presence of diverse temporal moments, which obviously is a lot to unpack in that quote, and allow us to talk about the conditions of the in-between, of the processes that happen, the relationships that are forged, and the possibilities that emerge in the midst of things, senses, memories, and effects. Which is a quote from Hamlet, which sounds wow, and Yanis writes in that way, and it's good. But again, the problem is, because we're only dealing with one case study and one person, and we're looking at her stuff, We
Yeah.
don't really get a sense of how what emerges, what relationships are forged, what processes are happening beyond that individual person. And so
Yeah.
while this, and so I don't think it's I'm not dismissing this work when I say I feel it is it's doing something original that people need to think about and talk about and think
Yeah.
about replication. But in terms of theory and method, I'm left a lot wanting as to how this case study shows that, you know, the how these objects create relationships, processes,
Yeah.
and, you know, a contingent co-presence. I didn't really, that didn't come out for me as well as it could have. But anyway, those are some reservations I had with the article as it is. But it's an innovative approach. I mean, what about the actual case study, Gafnan? What can you take us through some of, you know, how does Nairi sort of approach this innovative topic?
Well, it's actually really interesting. It's kind of like they're telling a story. So it does begin. We're following this lady through her life, um, and what, like, I guess, like, the case study talks about how this particular person was a caregiver of somebody who had dementia, and was then, I guess I could say, like, unfortunate enough to fall into dementia herself. And it follows the steps of this person. And I think it's actually very interesting because the case study has very nice, it's very well written. It's really chronological. It's very easy to follow. Um, and it begins talking about how from the beginning, their interest in archaeology is big. They are often collecting flint rocks when they go for walks, or possibly like when they go out. Um, it's enjoyable, and they like to, I guess, I guess what I would say post excavation. It's like the washing. She did her own research about what
Yeah.
goes where and what they are and what she found. I hope that she's an appropriate pronoun, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I
I'm
don't
going,
know. Fiona Gorman is the name used, so we can go that way. Yeah.
yeah, sure. And um, it's very
It
interesting.
says say she is living in residential care, so we're following the author. Yes.
Nice, perfect. All right. So she um, goes through all of this time for like a really long time. I think it's 10 years that it says that she was archiving archaeological things, both working at the museum there. I think it is, I can't remember it's exactly, the Heritage Museum of the Isle of Arran, I think it is. Arran, is that
Aaron, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Arran? Arran? Yeah, sorry.
That's okay.
My bad pronunciation. But yeah, anyways, it kind of goes through that and how after she got dementia herself, that process didn't necessarily stop. It took a pause for a while. But as the case study goes on, the author talks about how this hobby, I guess is what I would call it, gets picked up again. And it's the way that the case study, the lady then organizes the finds, collects the finds. What is she collecting? How
Yeah.
is she organizing them? And it really goes through the differences between the before and after um, the dementia situation. So it is actually quite interesting. I don't know. Maybe that's not very coherent.
No, it is. It is. And what about this paradolic properties thing that's
Oh
mentioned
yeah,
in the abstract? Because that was where the paper then next goes. So
yeah,
she says overall these multi-sensory assemblages offered tactile and audible pleasures, along with frequent opportunities for casual strewing, selecting, and handling of stone, and its remaking into temporary decorative displays. Because this lady had been an artist, she'd been an
yeah,
art teacher, and then she was interested in archaeology. So it was the ability to move them around. The coolness and smoothness of flint to the touch became an important feature over time.
yeah,
Pieces caressed with care and attention, items full of sensory intensity and effective weight. It is the tactile properties of these pieces that now become significant. Stones become both a comfort and companion in as dementia progresses. So
yeah.
that's really interesting, a very personal story. But then it goes on to these paradolic properties of things.
Yeah, I thought that was actually really cool. I mean, like, it starts talking about how the I guess it was a lot of the finds that they did find that were considered special. She marked them with a red dot. It's important. She marked them with a red dot. The important aspects of those were things that kind of represented human features. So yeah, basically things, flint or rocks that were maybe elongated, or they had like different colored veins going through them, or things like that. They mentioned quite a few examples. For example, they think it was like a pebble with a quartz vein going through it to represent a heart shape. And I mean, like, as I was, there's pictures of it as well in the article, which is very useful. The box that it's in is very beautiful. I love the box. But yeah, it is interesting to see how this woman had a connection with things that did look like eyes, that did look like hearts. They did have human-like features, and I guess that is a very personal thing. But of course, you can't say that everyone with dementia would have these feelings towards stone or rock. It is very personal to the case study. So what did you think about that?
Well, yeah, I thought it was fascinating, and I also thought it's mentioned that she reused aluminium trays that had been used for her ready meal containers brought to her by a carer or provided to contain these things. And I would like to have seen more about the containers themselves, as you say, the striking boxes, the foil containers, but also where these were, because the photographs in the article are very much them taken out of context, given us an archaeological scale as archaeological assemblages, but we don't get to see them in her home, or at least get a sense of how these objects operated. And again, maybe we need to look at the sister article to learn more about that. But I found that missed part of the point of the assemblages. The assemblage is the context in which it's found informs the assemblage. The vessels in which they are contained, are more than simply vessels. They are part of that assemblage. They allow different kinds of access, so that whether they were positioned on shelves, on floors, on sideboards, would have been useful to know a bit more detail about, and how they were moved around, how they were commingled, separated out, selected. But then this is a window onto a life, and it's difficult to know. But I thought those were points, I think, as well as the paradolic properties. I'd like to have learned more about how the vessels and context were operated in this way. How was this just messy, or was it ordered? Because obviously different individuals will have different ticks, different ways of managing their space, cleaning regimes that break down, but they still manage to do some tasks very well. And so that's the kind of thing that I think I'd like to learn more about. But yes, it's fascinating stuff. And where do we get to in the end with this article then, Afnan? What do you think is the overall implications for us as archaeologists? And
Oh, okay. Yeah. Sure. So yeah, I think like when it comes to what we can take away from this article, it is just one case study. So I think we need to remember that it is just one case study, and this doesn't affect it's different for every person. Everybody is different. Everybody is unique. And I think that like the author wants, it definitely, well, it's open for discussion. It does create discussion. It's very easy to talk about something like this because it's so broad. And I think that that's what I kind of like about it. So at the end, we kind of just start considering how archaeological finds or just collecting things can be, can represent the archaeology of dementia, and how we can kind of look at that in a wider landscape, I guess. And I guess that's the hope. I'm assuming that's the hope for the future of it.
But I don't think she says that. I think that's what I was hoping for her to say, and I agree with you. I agree with you 100%, because I thought she was going to, and perhaps she didn't say that, because the author, because she was reluctant to go, as has happened with certain other fields of contemporary archaeology research. Look, here's people today doing stuff. This now allows us to understand the Paleolithic. This allows us to understand the Neolithic of Anatolia. This helps us apply a newer perspective to the Bronze Age. And she doesn't go down that route. And perhaps that's because she just felt that would be too cringe and too banal. But I think there are points to be made about how we understand unaltered natural materials and recycled objects, bag collections, in things that are kept and stored, objects that have intimate associations with the person in the past. Doesn't mean the people in the past necessarily had dementia. It's about understanding those broader relationships of mnemonics and emotive qualities of objects. And
Yeah.
she doesn't really go there. And that was the thing that was really frustrating for me about the conclusion, because it's sat in the present, whereas those discussions about how we understand objects that have been inherited, object collections, hoarding practices, are massive areas of archaeological debate, depositional practices, and where this kind of approach not only helps understand dementia and sufferers of it, but it also helps us understand those broader sensorial archaeologies that Hamalakis is talking about. And for me, one of the cool things I'd be really interested in seeing more discussion of, and I'm not blaming Nairi for not doing it in this paper, is how this helps us understand funerary practice. Where objects are going into graves. Are these the objects that matter to the people who are dead, the deceased, the subjects of the funeral, and in which case we've always assumed these show their status, identity, their relationships. Well, maybe it's their random crap that they had and mattered to them, and no one else knew what to do with. Or conversely, are these objects that had particular textual material qualities that were handled by the mourners as a way of connecting the living and the dead, more than the material itself or the function of the object itself? And so this really is important for thinking about cremation practices, where you're collecting up the remains of the dead, handling the bones of the dead and other objects. When you're thinking about the vessel selected, those are the kinds of questions I was hoping to hear more about. And she doesn't really go there. She kind of stays in the present, and she says she hopes it prompts more new conversations and encourages more disciplinary responses and engagements to develop vital contributions that shape the future archaeologies of dementia. And I didn't know, and I was a bit lost there as to what that might mean. She says the unique dementia works presented here highlight the potential for appreciating how relational and sensorial assemblage-based archaeological approaches have much to offer current materialities of care research. So she's saying it's about modern care, how we care for people with dementia, and we respect and understand their objects, which I agree. But I also think these are not either or. What you said matters just as much as thinking about how this helps us understand care today. I don't know. That was my takeaway point.
I feel like I guess definitely I'm totally with you, but I also do think that there's a lot of criticism in suggesting something that is it's vague. Imagine writing a case study and you only have one, and then trying to relate that to something in the past, like you said, or even relating it to something else. Of course, potentially saying maybes and ifs and coulds, it's all great, but I can understand why maybe it was taken out of this, because if I was writing the paper and I was like, yeah, even if I thought it and I was like, oh well, maybe we could relate that, I wouldn't want you know I wouldn't want to put that in writing because we don't know yet, and it's a bit early to say. And especially with one case study, we're not entirely sure. And I think it's a very good setup for discussion. And I think that that's what the author wanted. And I do think it is, because the author does mention about how it's a very personal thing. And I do think that it is personal. Like for this particular case study, it was lithics, it was her assemblage, it was her stones. And like you said, when we look at grave goods and things, we assume it's about status. But I personally would like to be buried with my teddy bear that I've had for ages. That's, no one else would want that. No one would want that. But I would want that. And I think that you're right. It's something that we really do have to think about as archaeologists when looking at grave goods and thinking about, especially cremated things. What is it that we're looking at? And we can't just assume that it's the same thing every time, because that's just what the overall consensus says. So I think it's a very interesting take. And it's nice to kind of have that, even if it's at the back of your mind when you're looking at grave goods, when you're looking at things in archaeology, whether it's modern or in the past. I do think that it's still a very interesting, concept to think about. I don't know.
I also think one thing we should say is that this is about a named and living individual. And while we learn that Fiona is still with us and in care, she is named, and she is therefore, it's a very personal narrative about this lady. And in that regard, I think the paper is a kind of piece of emotional work by the author. Must be. I mean, we don't learn about the relationship, but there must be one. And the second line of the conclusion is, Fiona Gorman found comfort in stone and in the past being brought indoors and inside.
Yeah.
And while I must feel I felt awkward reading this paper because I felt it was too much of a window onto a person. I felt almost intrusive reading it. And there is an old ethical issue about naming individuals and their permissions, particularly if they're already a dementia sufferer. But at least one positive thing could be said is that the paper is an honour to that person. And I wrote a piece 12 years ago about a recently deceased person in the form of a co-author piece about the war memorial at Slapton Sands, which was finally created from a tank that was dredged up by Ken Smalls, who spent all his life, well, a large part of his life, beachcombing and gaining sort of almost after a mental breakdown. And so his engagement with archaeology was very much clearly, I mean, I didn't know him, but talking to people who knew him, including his son, we were able to find out that a part of his engagement with the landscape, the beach at Slapton Sands, the story of it being used as a battle training by the US Army ahead of D-Day, and his his desire to recognize the loss of life by the US Army during the battle training, and then dredging up this tank and it now being a war memorial. The Sherman duplex drive tank is now still there in Slapton Sands in the car park as a war memorial. He created that war memorial out of a piece of retrieved material culture. It was a heavily emotional, and possibly also to do with not dementia, but but mental trauma. He was using archaeology, or not archaeology, but engagement with the landscape, with the objects, with retrieval of objects, as an emotional and psychological process. And so I am very sensitive to recognizing the fact that when we're dealing with the contemporary past, we are dealing with individuals who are suffering in different ways. And I think this paper does do, even though it is anecdotal, it does reveal that broader discussion. I think the paper by Sam Walls and myself in the Cambridge Archaeological Journal from 2010 and this paper do offer parallel case studies to an archaeology of how we see archaeology, amateur archaeology, avocational archaeology, almost as not about learning about the past, but a way of coping and managing and healing sometimes in the present. So there's a lot to think about that links to, archaeologies of memory and archaeologies of material culture and death in particular, and thinking about our own mortality and remembrance. And this paper is a kind of small, getting back to my original point, this paper is a kind of small, she's not dead, she's not gone, but she's no longer with us in a full cognizant sense. She's not a co-author, but the paper is a kind of a memorial to Fiona and her contributions to archaeology and her life.
Absolutely. Yeah. I definitely, I agree with that. Yeah, maybe. No, but I do definitely think so. I mean, like the entire paper is talking about her life, and well, I guess not necessarily not word for word, but I mean like her engagement with archaeology throughout her life. And it's very, very interesting, to be honest. It is really interesting. And the stuff that she collected was super cool as well. Like, yeah, like just looking at the pictures, I think that
beautiful, aren't they?
They
They're
are.
beautiful.
They are very beautiful.
Even the aluminium trays, have a beauty to them, have a sort of shimmer. They have a brilliance to them when used as the backdrop to the object she's collecting. So I think there's a lot of discussions of aesthetics of unworked objects here that could be discussed.
What was interesting, because you were talking about this before, sorry to bring it up again, but like you were saying how like you wanted to see if there was an organized manner to them, because like in the article they do say that like in some of the aluminium boxes, some of them are like ordered, so like they're in rows.
Oh, that's true. Yes.
Yeah. Whereas others are just not. They're just kind of thrown in and they're piled up. It's a full box type thing. And I do think that it's interesting because so Fiona herself, she would write on the back of these, the lids for the boxes. Not the boxes, like the foil trays. I'm gonna call them a foil tray. And she'd write on the back of them, like for example, in the photo it says Flint tools. But there was also another one that would have eyes. There was one that had eyes written on it, and I do think that's interesting. Of the way that in like when it comes to not just the backdrop, but like the organization of a person going through dementia. I think that is, how would you, like, here is a box of Flint, this one is in order. Here is a box of Flint, there is no order. Here is a box of eyes. And I think it's interesting how, like, because I wouldn't, I mean, as an archaeologist, Flint is not Flint, but, you know, like any other person who wants to engage with archaeology or maybe is looking at finds, this is a rock. Rock is rock, you know, there is no difference, but obviously there definitely was for her. And I do think that's interesting. I would like to know more about that and how that differentiates. Because like you said, when you're talking about, for example, the beach, to anyone else, the beach is the beach. But to you, the beach is different. It's significant and it means something to you. And so I do think that specificness and that personal aspect of finds or even just memories and assemblages, that is what is important when it comes to things like this. But like,
and I think some people, every time they go for a walk with the dog on a beach, they may pick up a shell, and it's not, and there may be a pile of shells in the garden, and that may be not even brought inside or created into art, but it almost, by the pile accumulating, you are creating a meaningful assemblage that connects you to that place and to your behavior. When you can no longer walk your dog because you're of disability, those objects can have an enhanced meaning, or they can be discarded as embarrassing or upsetting to you because you can no longer collect them. But those are the stories I think we need to reflect on. I think of dog. I don't own a dog. I'm just using that as an example. But I think one thing that I'd like to learn more about is that, because this is going back to my point about the creation of relationships. This is, and I don't know enough about the individual person, but this is very much an auto construction. This is about one individual creating meanings with a collection of objects. And so often collecting is a very personalized and odd thing. Oh, there's old John, the weird uncle with his garage full of, you know, Matchbox toys or whatever it may be, model railway set, you know, whatever it may be the collecting is of, postage stamps. We see it as a very personal act. Maybe there's a group, but even then there's a community of people who share in that interest. And often these objects are then, when the person dies, they're inherited. But maybe the person was a metal detectorist and they inherited those objects. The family often don't know what to do with them. And sometimes they'll go to museums and say, do you want any of this? And sometimes they'll say, well, yes, if we knew where any of it came from, but they don't. So if those objects had been collected by an amateur simply because they like the fun of discovery, or did they like the act, you know, understanding collecting, understanding the emotional attachments to objects, to the arrangement, to the boxing, to the sorting, to the rearranging, the cleaning, these are all practices of care for the object that speak of that person. But I really wanted to learn about what happens when inheritance has to happen, the dislocations. You know, we didn't learn about where these stones are going. Are they just going to be dumped in the garden? Are they going to be, you know, what's going to happen to these? I mean, some of them are accessioned. Sorry, forgive me. Nairi does say some of them have been accessioned into a museum. And I think this is a really interesting broader question about you know, relationships down the generations and within families, within friendships, of what these objects mean. Anyway, there's lots of interesting ideas and a wonderful paper. And let's remind listeners that this is in Antiquity 96 386 422 to 435, and we'll put a link to the DOI in the description of the video below. Any other final thoughts, Afnan?
I mean, like you said, I'm totally with you. There's a lot to say. There's a lot to discuss about the paper. But like, I think what's to say now? Just leave it up to either the listeners or the readers. I don't know. What do you think about it? Like, I just think it's a very interesting topic, and you can discuss this all day long. So not really much else to say on this side.
Well, let's just go out and collect some objects and that look like eyes and make our own collections. I mean, some people love glass, and other beach worn glass is a wonderful textured material. You know, other people like, I mean, shells. There's so much people collect that isn't human altered, but is still a powerful. Feathers. You know, people collect bracken and all sorts of things. And yeah, it's a fascinating topic of why do people select the things they do, and what does it tell them, and can they even themselves? Because that's the other question is we haven't asked Fiona. But if we could ask Fiona, would she give us the same answer, or would she just say something different? And how do we include the voices of people who are dementia sufferers, or do we just say, oh well, they can't explain it because they're dementia sufferers? Is that in itself a problem we have to face as researchers if we only talk to cognizant younger people about their rationales for doing things? Because if this was, say, a homeless person in his 20s, we definitely want to hear his statement about his behaviors. Or if this was a middle-aged white archaeologist sitting in North Wales like me, you'd want to hear what they say about why they collect things. So the fact this is in this Fiona's voice herself isn't there is both fascinating and unsettling, I feel. But anyway.
Yeah, I mean, like, I totally with you, but I do want to say actually on that point is that to an extent, I do think it's very interesting that her voice is not there, because when we look at archaeology, when we look at past items, we don't have that voice.
No.
We have to assume, we have to see the evidence, we have to kind of gather and infer information from what we have. And I think like this is a very good example of course, I would love to know what is in her mind, and Fiona's mind, that is. But maybe we can't. Maybe she doesn't want to talk about it, you know, because maybe it's so personal that she doesn't want it in an article or whatever. And I do think that it's, to an extent, that is what archaeology is. Here is evidence. Here is stuff. What is it? We can't ask them because they're long gone. So what's next? So I do think I kind of like that her voice is kind of taken out of that. It gives it a very archaeological feel. Even though it's talking about modern archaeology and contemporary archaeology, it still has that aspect of we don't know because we never know. We can just assume. So yeah, I guess.
And on that point, thank you very much, Avna. That salient point, I think we shall wrap this up. We'll see you all next time for another Let's Talk Random Archaeology.
Yeah, see you.